Grace Whitmore was just a few steps from home when it happened. A white cop slammed her, an unarmed 62-year-old black woman, against a wall and pressed his arm across her throat. No warning, no crime, just power unchecked. But Grace didn't panic. She stood her ground, silent, because she knew something he didn't. What happens when the woman he tried to silence turns out to be the judge's wife and the whole city is watching? If that question stops you in your tracks, tap like, drop a comment, and let's step into Grace's story. It was the kind of Sunday morning that felt like it had been quietly waiting all week to arrive, warm, but not hot, breezy, but not cold, and wrapped in the soft hum of distant church bells that lingered just a moment longer in the air. Grace Whitmore stepped out of St. Mark's Baptist like she had for decades, her polished shoes tapping gently against the stone steps, one hand carrying a small leather-bound Bible, the other clutching a bouquet of white lilies tied with a pale blue ribbon. She moved slowly, but not because of age. Grace moved with intention, with presence, as if every step had a reason, and every reason had weight. She wore a navy blue crepe dress, the kind that caught light without calling attention to itself, and at the base of her throat rested a silver dove-shaped brooch that glinted faintly each time her chin lifted toward the sunlight. Her gray hair, twisted neatly into a bun at the nape of her neck, hadn't shifted a strand. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had spent her life teaching, leading, loving, and choosing every day to show up with dignity and tact. Every year on this day, her wedding anniversary, Grace came to the morning service alone. Not out of sadness, not out of ritual, but because she believed some things are worth returning to even if the world around you forgets. Even if your husband was too busy in court to walk beside you, even if the pew beside you remained empty. She sat 3 rows from the front, sang the hymns without opening the book, lit a candle after the final blessing, and then walked the same 2 blocks home to make a quiet dinner for 2. Whether he arrived or not didn't change the rhythm. The rhythm was the point. She passed through the old iron gate and stepped onto the sidewalk, the lilies bobbing gently with each step. The street was mostly quiet, families dispersing in different directions. Children tugging on the hands of grandparents, murmured goodbyes, folding into the soft rustle of spring leaves above. A sparrow darted low over the walkway, and Grace's lips curled, slightly more muscle memory than smile. She adjusted her grip on the flowers, glanced once toward the sky, and continued forward. There was no reason to notice the patrol car at first. It was just there across the street, angled slightly to face the block tucked behind a row of parked sedans. But something in the stillness of it didn't feel quite right. It wasn't the vehicle itself, it was the way it seemed to be waiting. Not idle, not resting, just watching. Grace felt it before she saw it. That subtle pressure at the back of the neck. That quiet weight that slips over your shoulders when you realize someone is measuring your presence without saying a word. She kept walking. Not today. She whispered it softly. Not to challenge, not to invite. But as if she were speaking directly to the air, as if the wind might carry the words to whatever tension had started to rise unseen. The cruiser didn't move, but the silhouette inside shifted. Driver's side, window down, elbow resting on the frame. A white man, maybe late 30s, no sunglasses, no phone, no smile. Just stillness, that deliberate kind. The kind Grace had seen in parking lots, in checkout lines, in waiting rooms. A stillness that didn't come from calm, but from calculation. She didn't panic. Grace didn't do panic. Instead, her mind, quiet and quick, began ticking through a familiar checklist. Her ID was in her purse. Phone was charged. She had locked the gate at the church. Her dress was modest. Her hair was neat. She was in every measurable way respectable. That used to be enough. But Grace had lived long enough to know that some days your skin walks into the room before you do. And no matter how gently you move, no matter how quietly you speak, some people only see what they want to see. The scent of magnolia drifted down from the trees above, mixing sweet with sharp in the back of her throat. She inhaled through her nose. Let it anchor her. Her home was at the end of the block, just past the red brick library, behind the row of azaleas her husband had planted the year they bought the house. The porch light would flick on as she approached, motion sensor tripping just as it always did. She could already see it, so she kept moving, even as the sidewalk felt narrower, even as the air grew heavier, even as the silence behind her shifted. And somewhere deep in her memory came the soft voice of her mother, the one that always surfaced when things were about to turn. Baby, they don't need a reason, just the wrong moment and the right excuse. She didn't hear the car door open, but she knew. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from calculation. And in that moment, Grace Whitmore felt it land behind her like a shadow with its own weight. She slowed her steps just enough to listen. Then a voice called out flat and controlled, like it was used to being obeyed. "Excuse me, ma'am, mind stopping a moment?" Grace turned. The officer was already walking toward her, one hand resting on his belt, the other swinging loose. His uniform was crisp, boots clean. Young face, square jaw, maybe late 30s. No badge number visible. No smile offered. "Yes," Grace answered, calm, steady. Her fingers curled tighter around the stems of the lilies. "Do you live around here?" His voice was casual, but his eyes were already searching her neckline to shoes. Eyes lingering just a second too long on the color of her skin. "I do," she said plainly. "Just up ahead, third house on the left. I've lived there for 38 years. The officer didn't nod, didn't look away. "Do you have ID on you?" Grace raised one brow slightly. "I'm sorry. Am I under suspicion of something?" He didn't answer that, just stepped a little closer. "There's been a call. Someone reported a woman matching your description, walking slowly around homes 2 blocks over. Said it looked suspicious, thought she might be casing the neighborhood." Grace blinked. "I see," she said. "And what exactly about me looks suspicious?" "Ma'am, I'm just asking a simple question. Can I see your ID, please?" Grace didn't move. Her face didn't change. She let the question hang there for a beat, then replied, "I'm walking home from church, officer, in plain view. Carrying a Bible and flowers, that's all." He squinted. "I didn't ask what you were carrying. I asked for ID." Her voice remained soft but firmer now, and I asked if I was under suspicion of a crime. "You're not making this easier." She tilted her head slightly. "Easier for whom?" His jaw flexed. "Ma'am, I'm not here to argue. Just let me see some ID and you can be on your way." "I am on my way," she said finally, shifting her hand to rest on her purse strap, but not reaching in yet. "And I've lived on this street since you were in high school. I've never once been asked for identification to walk home." "Well," he said coldly, "things change." Grace stepped half a pace forward, not aggressive, just enough to let her presence be known. "Yes," she said. "They do. But some things haven't. Like assuming a black woman doesn't belong in her own neighborhood." Now the tone changed. His posture stiffened. One foot shifted back slightly, subtle but trained. His hand moved closer to his radio. "You need to calm down," he said tightly. "I'm just doing my job." Grace's voice dropped lower. "Then do it properly." There was a long pause. For a moment, the birds kept singing. The trees swayed gently, and yet none of it reached the space between them. It had gone quiet in the way tension always does before it decides which direction to break. Then he said it. "Why are you being difficult?" And she replied, still calm, still unshaken. "Because I've learned what happens when you're too easy." The air turned heavy. He stepped closer now. Too close. His shadow overlapped hers. The brim of his hat dipped just above her eyeline. No words, just pressure. Measured, male, deliberate. Grace didn't flinch. But she felt it. The moment things shifted. When the question wasn't about ID anymore, it was about power. "I'd like to continue walking to my home now," she said clearly. He didn't move. Instead, he said quieter this time. "You sure you want to go that route?" There it was. Not a threat, not quite, but not one either. Grace held his gaze. "I've walked this route for 38 years, and I'm still walking it today." And then, without raising her voice, without breaking stride, she turned and began walking again. Slow, straight-backed, each step deliberate, but she knew he was still behind her, and now so did we. There's a kind of silence that doesn't ask for your attention, it demands it. That's what Grace noticed first. The wind had quieted. The birds had gone still. Even the air itself felt tighter, like the whole street was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. But Grace kept walking one measured step at a time, her spine straight, her grip steady on the lilies that now drooped ever so slightly in her hand. She didn't have to look over her shoulder. Officer Reddick's footsteps stayed close, never brushing her heels, but always near enough to remind her he was there. His presence wasn't meant to stop her. It was meant to shrink her, and Grace knew the difference. Then, just as she reached the edge of her neighbor's lawn, a voice broke through the stillness, sharp, urgent, and almost too brave for its own good. "Officer, excuse me, she's our neighbor." It was Linda Blake. Everyone on the street knew Linda. White, late 50s, lived 2 doors down. They had exchanged Christmas pies for years, helped each other carry groceries, stood side by side at funerals. Now Linda was standing in the middle of her front lawn, one hand raised, the other clutching her phone, her voice cracking with disbelief. "She lives right there," she said again. "That's Grace Whitmore. She's not doing anything." Reddick didn't even turn his head. "Step back, ma'am," he said, his voice cold and sharp, "or I'll detain you too." The words landed like a slap across the whole block. Linda froze. Her eyes darted toward Grace, filled with something between apology and powerlessness. She opened her mouth to say more, but nothing came. Her feet backed up, slowly, reluctantly. And in that moment, the message was clear, not just to her, but to everyone watching from their porches and windows. They weren't safe either. Across the street, under the shadow of a tall elm, a teenager stood filming on his phone. Grace saw the outline of the boy, then the face. It took her a second, but then she remembered. Jalen Torres. 16 now, but she'd taught him in middle school. Bright, curious, quiet, always watching the world like it was a puzzle only he could solve. He had once stayed after class to ask her if every revolution had to begin with a riot, or if sometimes silence could be louder. Now that same boy stood still, his phone capturing everything. He didn't say a word. He didn't look away. But just before Grace turned her eyes forward again, she saw him nod barely. A flicker of something between respect and sorrow passed between them. He knew exactly what he was filming, and he knew exactly why. Down the block, a jogger slowed. A delivery driver lingered at his van. A mother stepped back into her doorway, gently pulling her daughter inside. They all saw it. A black woman walking, a white officer trailing her. A whole street frozen under the weight of watching and doing nothing, because saying something might cost them more than they could afford. Grace felt the heat rise behind her ears, not from the sun, but from the fury coiled tight in her chest. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was disappointment. In the neighbors who once asked for her garden tips, in the mothers whose children she had tutored, in the good people now standing perfectly still. The sidewalk cracked beneath her next step. Her knees felt slightly unsteady, but she kept going. The lilies hung heavier. The silence thickened again. And then came his voice. "Stop right there." She stopped, not because of the order, because her front gate was only 5 steps away. "This is your last warning," Officer Reddick said, his voice rising just enough to echo down the block. "Show me ID or I will place you under arrest." Grace turned, slowly. The block behind her looked like a photograph, still colorless, waiting to be developed. She looked him in the eye, steady as stone. "I told you," she said, her voice calm but undeniable. "I live here." In that moment, the tension reached a pitch no one could name. Windows stayed open, but voices stayed shut. Phones kept recording, but no one stepped forward. It felt like the sky itself was waiting for what would come next. Grace lowered her eyes for a second, just enough to see the lilies in her hand now bent, bruised, but not broken, just like her. And then she took one more breath. Not to prepare for battle, to remember who she was, in case they tried to make her forget. There are moments in life that don't unfold, they explode. Grace didn't move, didn't flinch. She stood in her own yard beneath the same oak tree her husband planted 30 years ago, with nothing in her hands but a crumpled bouquet of lilies and the remains of her Sunday peace. And still, Officer Kyle Reddick stepped forward like she was armed with something dangerous, like her dignity was a threat. "I'm not going to tell you again," he said, voice sharp enough to slice through the still air. "Show me your ID." Grace looked at him with steady eyes and answered like she always had when standing in front of a room full of students who didn't believe in themselves yet. "I told you I live here." That was the last line. The moment his patience snapped, and with it the pretense, he surged forward without warning. One hand gripped her arm, the other clamped around her throat with brutal speed. The lilies tumbled from her fingers like snow shaken from a branch. Her quinton slipped under her elbow, fell to the dirt, the pages scattering like doves, startled from a steeple. "Ma'am, stop resisting!" he shouted, dragging her back from the gate. "I'm not," Grace choked out, but her voice was cut short by the pressure against her windpipe. The crowd across the street erupted. Voices clashed over each other like thunderheads rolling in too fast. "Let her go!" someone yelled. "She's not resisting," cried Linda. "Oh my God, he's choking her!" screamed a teenage girl from a nearby porch. And then the sound of something even louder, Jalen's voice shaking but clear, broadcasting to the world through his phone. "Live streaming now. Officer Reddick is assaulting Grace Whitmore in her own front yard. Get this out. Everyone needs to see this." The boy stepped closer, his hand trembling, the lens catching every frame. Grace's face pressed against the brick wall, her navy dress catching the light, her pearls snapping one by one and falling to the ground like a trail of broken silence. She couldn't breathe. The bricks were cool against her cheek, but her skin burned. Her heart pounded in her ears. Still, she didn't cry out, didn't fight back. Her body sagged slightly, not from weakness, but from the awareness of exactly what the world would see if she dared to struggle. She knew the narrative too well, the older black woman resisting arrest. She could already hear how they'd twist it. But Jalen's camera didn't lie. From every angle, it was clear she wasn't resisting. She was enduring. Then came the sound of tires. A second police cruiser pulled up behind Reddick's. Its lights weren't flashing, but the door swung open fast, and another officer jumped out. He was younger, black, badge shining. He called out Reddick. "What are you doing?" Reddick didn't respond. His hand still gripped Grace's shoulder. Her knees had buckled, but she was still standing, half held up by the wall, half by sheer will. "Let her go!" The second officer shouted louder now. Reddick's grip loosened, but not all the way. His eyes didn't move from Grace, like he was trying to decide if backing down would cost him more than pushing forward. The younger officer stepped closer, jaw tight, voice low but hard. "She's not resisting. She's not under arrest. Get your hands off her. Now." The tension crackled like dry leaves about to ignite. For a second, no one breathed. Then the second officer reached between them and placed a firm hand on Reddick's arm. "That's an order, Kyle." It broke the trance. Reddick yanked his hands away. Grace stumbled, and the younger officer caught her just in time, gently steadying her, as she gasped for air, hands shaking. The whole block froze again, but this time it was different. The silence wasn't fear. It was something colder. Outrage. Cameras were everywhere now. Windows wide open. Children watching from porches. Linda crying from her lawn. The jogger filming. Even the delivery driver had his phone up. And Grace. She stood holding her side. Her pearls shattered at her feet, the smell of brick dust in her nose, but still. She didn't look down. The younger officer whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't know he..." But Grace raised her hand slightly, just enough to tell him not now, because something else had arrived. A low rumble in the distance, not another cruiser, not sirens, wheels, big ones, the kind that belonged to someone with power. Every head turned. A black SUV rolled slowly down the block's sleek-tinted windows, no lights but moving with unmistakable purpose. It didn't speed. It didn't swerve. It simply moved like it knew exactly where it was going. Reddick turned too confused. His eyes narrowed. The SUV pulled up just behind the second cruiser. It idled for a moment, then the engine cut. A door opened, and for a moment no one inside stepped out. The pause was surgical, tactical, like the calm right before a storm knows it has your full attention. Grace blinked, her breath still shaky. But something inside her straightened bone by bone. She looked toward the SUV not in fear, in recognition. The crowd leaned in, and before anyone could speak, a figure moved in the shadows of the passenger side. But that was the beginning of the next moment, the one no one would ever forget. The passenger door eased open, and for a moment time itself seemed to hesitate. Out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man in a slate-gray suit, pressed clean collar sharp. His shoes hit the pavement with the weight of someone who didn't need to speak to be heard. His pace was unhurried, his presence calm, too calm for a moment this tense. But that calm didn't read as weakness. It read as control. Grace saw him first, and for the first time since this began, her shoulders softened, not because she needed rescue, but because she knew what was coming. He walked forward slowly, weaving between the stunned silence of the neighbors, the stunned confusion of the officers, the stunned stillness of a world that had just shifted without understanding how. Marcus Whitmore, her husband, and not just a husband, a federal judge. He didn't look at the phones. He didn't scan the crowd. His eyes locked onto Reddick like a courtroom spotlight, quiet, unwavering, unmistakable. Reddick blinked twice, took one half step back, then caught himself, stiffened, glanced at the badge on Marcus's breast pocket, then froze. Marcus stopped 3 paces away, hands still at his sides. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Step away from my wife. Those 5 words landed heavier than a gavel. No shouting, no drama. Just the calm certainty of a man who had seen every trick of power play out in 100 courtrooms and knew exactly when silence had run its course. Officer Reddick opened his mouth, then closed it again. The younger officer beside Grace, still holding her steady, glanced at Marcus, then at Grace, then slowly stepped back, letting her find her own footing. Marcus didn't move to help her, not yet, not out of coldness, but out of respect. Grace had stood alone through the worst of it. He knew she would want to stand now. Reddick swallowed hard. His fingers twitched at his belt. The moment stretched thin. Marcus spoke again, a little firmer. Is there a reason, Officer Reddick, that my wife, a 62-year-old woman with no history of criminal conduct, no weapon, no aggression, was assaulted on her own property this morning? Reddick opened his mouth again, and this time he managed half a sentence. She refused to show ID when asked. I had cause to. Marcus didn't flinch. She lives here. I didn't know that. No, Marcus cut in, still not raising his voice. You didn't care to know. The street was now dead quiet. The phones were still recording, but no one dared speak. It wasn't fear anymore. It was awe. Jalen, still holding the live stream steady, whispered just loud enough to be heard. That's her husband, and he's a judge. Someone else repeated it. Then another. The truth rippled through the crowd like the final twist in a courtroom drama no one had seen coming. Linda clutched her mouth. He's a federal judge. Someone else whispered. Oh my God. Marcus turned his gaze to the second officer, his tone now gentler. Son, thank you for stepping in. You may want to note your report carefully. The younger officer nodded quickly, eyes wide. Then finally Marcus turned to Grace, not with pity, not with panic, but with quiet reverence. He didn't rush. He didn't touch her yet. He simply met her eyes. You all right? Grace nodded once, barely. Marcus took one step closer and offered his arm, not to hold her up, but to walk beside her. Only now did she accept it. The two of them turned slowly together toward the gate of their home. The moment was unspoken, but everyone watching understood. This wasn't an escape. It was an exit with dignity. As they walked toward the door, Reddick remained frozen. His hand still hovered near his radio, but he didn't press it. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't undo what had been filmed, witnessed, and within minutes would be shared across every screen in the country. Marcus paused once more before opening the gate. Then over his shoulder he offered one final sentence. It wasn't loud, but it echoed. I suggest you call your supervisor. And with that, the gate clicked behind them. Grace didn't look back. She didn't have to. The damage was already done. But so was the reckoning, and it had only just begun. 15 minutes. That's all it took for the entire street to transform from an ordinary Sunday block to the epicenter of a reckoning. Grace and Marcus had only just stepped inside when another cruiser pulled up. No lights, no urgency. But the air changed the moment the door opened and Sergeant Marla Trent stepped out. She didn't rush. She didn't posture. She simply scanned the scene like she'd seen too many versions of this day before. Tall, composed, and unmistakably tired of covering for what couldn't be covered anymore. She was the kind of black woman who had earned every wrinkle through decades of silence in uniform, and she wasn't going to waste any more words than needed. She walked toward Officer Reddick, her expression unreadable. He straightened as she approached, but there was hesitation in the movement now, like he didn't know whether to salute or defend himself. Sergeant Trent. He started voice tight. I responded to a suspicious person report, female matching description, acting erratically in the neighborhood. She cut him off with just a look. Where is the suspicious person now? Reddick blinked, looked back toward the house. Marcus stepped back outside, calm as ever, holding the screen door for Grace, who stood tall behind him. Marla's eyes narrowed. Marcus didn't yell. He didn't point. He simply walked forward with the weight of the law behind his every word. She was assaulted, he said, voice firm but precise. By your officer, in broad daylight, on her own property, in front of witnesses, and now in front of you. Sergeant Trent looked at him, eyes sharpening slightly. She recognized him, there was no mistaking it. Her nod was small, professional. Judge Whitmore. Reddick took a half step forward, desperate to reclaim ground slipping fast beneath his feet. She refused to comply. I gave multiple commands. She didn't produce ID when asked. I had probable cause to detain. Grace's voice interrupted. Calm, steady. You didn't see me, she said softly. You saw what you expected to see. That landed harder than anything else had all morning. Even the neighbors stopped murmuring. Marla turned to look at Grace then, and something shifted in her eyes. Not sympathy, not guilt. Recognition. There was a long beat of silence. Then she faced Reddick again. Her voice dropped lower. You're done for today. What he blinked. Sarge, with respect. Hand over your badge and weapon. Now. Reddick froze. And then for the first time that day, the crowd didn't stay silent. Applause broke out. Not wild, not chaotic. Just one person clapping at first, then another, then another. It wasn't a celebration. It was release. The first small crack in a wall that had stood too long. Reddick's hand hovered at his holster, then slowly moved to unclip his badge. His face didn't hide it well. He wasn't sorry. He was stunned. Like he couldn't believe the system wasn't shielding him this time. Marcus watched quietly, hands still folded. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. Grace stood beside him, bruises forming along her throat, but her back was straight. When Reddick finally stepped away, walking toward his cruiser under the eyes of every neighbor, every phone, and every second thought he'd ever have again, he no longer looked like an officer in charge. He looked like a man being escorted off his own stage. Marla turned once more to Marcus. We'll be opening a formal internal review, she said. And your wife has the right to file charges. Immediately. Marcus gave a short nod. She will, he said. And Grace, she didn't say another word. She just met Marla's gaze. Two black women in uniform and out sharing an unspoken truth. How many times this had happened? How many hadn't been caught on camera? How many names didn't make it home? But this time was different. This time the silence had ended. That night the house was quieter than it had ever been. Not empty, but weighted. As if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what Grace and Marcus would do next. Outside, the street had emptied. The cameras were gone. The neighbors had retreated into their homes where the silence grew louder than the afternoon chaos. But inside the Whitmore home, the lights stayed on. The dining table, usually reserved for Sunday meals and gentle conversations, was now covered in yellow notepads, pens, open laptops, and 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea no one touched. No one. Grace sat at the head of the table, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her notebook open in front of her. Her handwriting, once neat and gentle, was now urgent, slanted with purpose. She drew a line down the page and began writing names. Pastor Melvin. Rita Bowman, retired journalist, used to cover civil rights back in the day. DeAndre, the young activist who ran youth programs at the rec center. And Jalen. She paused at his name, underlined it once. Across from her, Marcus was on the phone, voice low but steady. He'd already called the city council, left messages for 2 federal colleagues, sent an email to the ethics committee. Now he was dialing a retired judge. They both trusted a woman who owed Marcus nothing but respected him deeply. Every now and then they would glance at each other, not to ask for permission, not for reassurance, but for rhythm. As if they were conducting something bigger than a plan. Half an hour passed like that. No TV, no music, just the scratching of pen on paper and the clicking of phone keys. Then came the ding. Grace looked down at her phone. A text. From Jalen. It was short. Just a video link. And one line beneath it. You made me believe standing matters. She didn't respond right away. She let her thumb hover over the screen, then turned the phone toward Marcus. He watched the video load, grainy at first, but then clear. The moment the officer shoved Grace. The Bible falling. Her standing. Marcus stepping forward. The badge. The silence. And then the shift. The camera didn't shake. Jalen had held it steady. No panic, just bearing witness. Marcus nodded once. He's why we have this, he said softly. Grace looked back down at her list, tapping her pen near Jalen's name. I don't want this to be just a victory, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want it to end with applause in the street, or another headline that fades by Monday. Marcus leaned forward. Then let's turn it into a movement. The words settled between them like a contract, not of revenge, of reckoning, because this wasn't just about what had happened today. It wasn't just about Reddick. It wasn't just about a bruised throat and a shattered string of pearls. It was about every silent nod Grace had given over the years to injustices, small and sharp. It was about every case Marcus had presided over, every ruling he'd made, every time he questioned whether justice was truly blind or just afraid to see. Now the world had seen, and it wasn't going to look away. By the end of the night, the list had grown. So had the plan. Not a press conference, not a lawsuit, not just yet, but a gathering. One room, one night. Everyone who mattered, and everyone who thought they didn't. Because if this was going to change anything, it had to begin not in the courtroom, but around a table where every voice had a seat. Grace closed her notebook, her hand steady. Tomorrow they'd begin. But tonight they planted something far more powerful than protest. They planted purpose. They came early. Not because they had to, but because they needed to. By the time the courtroom doors opened at 8:30, there was already a line stretching around the block. Former students in dress shirts, church mothers in floral blouses, local reporters with notepads and lenses drawn like weapons of truth. Everyone came to see what justice looked like when it had no place to hide. Grace walked in holding her own briefcase, not because she needed to present anything, but because dignity walks in prepared. Marcus walked a step behind, not because he was less important, but because he knew this was her day. Inside the room buzzed with anticipation, but the noise dropped to a hush when the judge entered. Not Marcus. He had recused himself, and rightly so. Instead, it was Judge Miriam Dawson, a veteran jurist known for her steel backbone and unflinching gavel. All rise. And they did. Kyle Reddick sat at the defendant's table, no longer in uniform, wearing a suit too crisp for the mood, his jaw locked as if still waiting for the authority he once wielded to bail him out one last time. But this time it wouldn't. The prosecution opened with the video. No dramatics, just the clip. Jalen's footage lit up the courtroom screen. You could hear the scrape of Grace's Bible on concrete. You could see her throat caught in Reddick's forearm. You could hear someone, maybe Linda, maybe a stranger, screaming, "She's not resisting." And then the silence when Marcus stepped into frame. That one moment when power shifted without a single word. Judge Dawson paused the video, then nodded toward the jury. Next came the witnesses. Linda Blake took the stand, voice trembling but firm. "I told him she lives there. I told him she's our neighbor." He didn't listen. A younger officer followed Officer Dean Morales, nervous, glancing down often. But when asked if this was the first time Reddick had acted with unnecessary force, he hesitated only a second too long. "No," he finally said. "There were other times. He crossed lines before." We looked away. You could feel the breath leave the room. The defense shifted in their seats. But the blow hadn't landed yet. That came when Grace stood. No lawyer prepped her, no papers in hand, just her voice. "I've taught in this city for 35 years. I've written letters for scholarships, sat beside grieving mothers, buried children who couldn't outrun the streets. I've read bedtime stories at shelters and taught Sunday school even after retirement. I've seen good officers. I've known great ones. Kyle Reddick wasn't one of them." She paused, eyes scanning the jury, then settling briefly on Reddick. He didn't attack a stranger. He attacked someone who taught his children. The silence that followed was not heavy, it was sacred. She stepped down without another word. The closing arguments came and went like echoes, necessary but unable to compete with what had already been said. The jury deliberated for just under 2 hours. When they returned, the courtroom felt like it was holding a single breath. The foreperson stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant Kyle Reddick guilty of assault in the 2nd degree, guilty of civil rights violation through racial bias, and guilty of abuse of power under the color of law." The words hung for a second. Then Judge Dawson nodded. Sentencing would come later, but the verdict was clear. Kyle Reddick sat frozen. His hands, once used to restrain others, now clenched white on the edge of the table, powerless. He didn't speak. He didn't look at Grace. And outside the courthouse, when the crowd spilled back onto the steps, they didn't chant. They didn't cheer. They exhaled, because something had shifted. It wasn't the end of injustice, but it was the end of silence. And for Grace Whitmore, that was enough for now. It didn't happen with banners. There were no fireworks, no victory parades down Main Street. But that's not how real change shows up anyway. It begins quieter, like the slow pull of dawn after a long, unrelenting night. Marcus didn't take a break after the verdict. While others were still catching their breath, He walked into his office at the federal courthouse and requested a full audit of police conduct records for the past decade. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. He simply said, "We owe the public truth, and we owe our silence an apology." Within a week, internal review boards were convened. Cases once buried beneath standard procedure were reopened. Officers once protected by the benefit of the doubt now found themselves answering real questions. And, in a move that no one saw coming, Marcus appointed Sergeant Marla Trent. Yes, the same officer who'd de-escalated the situation that Sunday to chair a civilian oversight task force. But when she tried to decline saying, "Sir, someone else could," he cut her off gently. "You didn't look away, Marla. You looked in." And that mattered. What happened next was even more unexpected. Grace accepted a position she never sought, chairwoman of the Community Oversight Council. She only agreed after days of wrestling. After rereading every letter she'd kept from former students, after a walk through her old classroom, after remembering what it felt like to have no voice, and then one day to find it. When she finally spoke at the council's first open forum, the room was full, but still, she stood without a script. "I never wanted to be the face of a cause. But I've spent too much of my life teaching people how to find their voice to ignore it when mine was called upon. We all saw what happened. What matters now is how we choose to live after we've seen it." The next voice that rose came from the back of the room. It was Linda Blake, the same neighbor who once only offered a few words on a sidewalk. She stepped forward, eyes wet, voice trembling. "We let her stand alone," she said. "But not again. Never again." Something shifted in that moment, not just in the air, but in the room itself. People who had never spoken in public before began raising their hands. A retired bus driver shared how he'd been pulled over 6 times in 1 month for random checks. A nurse spoke of watching her teenage son flinch every time a patrol car passed. A high school student asked if they could create a youth advisory board to the council. And for the first time in decades, people who had lived side by side for years without ever truly hearing each other began to speak like neighbors. Not as Democrats or Republicans, not as black or white, but as people. The rage had not disappeared, but it had somewhere to go now, into action, into policy, into conversation. Marcus would later say justice isn't a verdict. It's a decision we keep making every day after. Grace, on the other hand, never tried to define what was happening. She simply showed up, meeting after meeting, notebook in hand, listening more than speaking, and when asked if she was proud, she always gave the same answer. "I'm not proud yet. I'm still watching." And so was the country. Because sometimes the loudest revolutions begin in the softest rooms. And sometimes change doesn't roar. It listens. The sun was softer that morning. Less about light, more about warmth. Grace walked slowly along the familiar stretch of sidewalk where it all began. Her steps unhurried, her silence deliberate. There was no press, no security escort, just the sound of cicadas humming in the distance and the faint rustle of leaves as the wind passed through. When she reached the wall, the one where her body had been pinned and her breath stolen, she paused. Someone had left fresh lilies, wrapped in brown paper. No note. Just a single line scrawled across the base of the wall in thick, uneven handwriting. She stood for all of us. For a moment, Grace said nothing. She just stood there, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, as if letting time fold into itself right there on that patch of brick. Behind her, a soft voice broke the quiet. "Ma'am?" She turned. A young black girl, no older than 10, stood holding a school notebook to her chest. Her shoes were a little too big. Her braids were a little too tight. But her eyes, they were wide with something that looked like hope and hesitation all at once. "Can I be like you?" the girl asked. There was a stillness, the kind that makes you catch your breath without meaning to. Before Grace could speak, Marcus stepped up beside her. He looked down at this girl, then back at his wife, and said simply, "You already are. You just have to keep standing." The girl smiled, unsure if she should believe it, but wanting to. Grace knelt slightly, just enough to meet her eyes. She didn't say anything profound. She didn't quote scripture or history. She just reached out and touched the girl's shoulder gently, like a baton being passed, not with weight, but with trust. And then she turned back to the wall. She reached out, placed her hand where the red brick had once pressed into her spine. Her palm rested there for a moment longer than necessary. Not out of pain, not out of memory, but out of choice. Then she stood tall again, took Marcus's arm, and together they walked on. There were no grand speeches that day. No applause, no headlines. Just a quiet reminder that reckoning isn't a moment, it's a mirror. And sometimes it's not about who makes history, but about who refuses to forget it. Because the truth is, what happened to Grace could have ended with a trial, but it didn't. It became a turning point, not just for one woman, not just for one city, but for anyone who's ever been told to sit down when they were meant to stand. And that's the thing about reckoning, it doesn't belong to courts or cameras. It belongs to us, all of us. Some stories end with a verdict. But the one you just heard about Grace and Marcus Whitmore isn't about an ending. It's about awakening, about what happens when courage stands its ground and dignity refuses to bend. It's a story of love, resilience, and the quiet power of not walking away, even when the world expects you to. If Grace's story moved you, if it made you think or feel something deeper, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and most importantly, subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories, so you never miss the stories that matter most. Every click, every share, every new subscriber reminds us why we do this, why we dig deep, craft carefully, and tell these stories not just to inform, but to transform. And if you remember just one thing from today, let it be this. Sometimes standing still is the loudest thing you can do. Thanks for being here. Now let's keep standing, together.